the objective is, thank you very much. The objective is to chat a bit about the interview process, the interviews that some of our teams will be doing. I think some of the teams may have already started doing, but there was a request to kind of get some information about, all right, are there some things we ought to know, some training we ought to do? So my name is David Bodery. I am a faculty member at Sinclair Community College. I am the chair of the communication department. One of the favorite classes that I am able to teach on occasion is an interviewing class. And while we cover all kinds of types of interviewing, I thought what we could do today would cover some of those basic elements. And who wants to go next? Cheryl, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure, happy to do that. So I'm Cheryl Roller, and I am the president of the League of Women Voters of Metro Columbus. Along with Tim, I'm the co-chair of the core planning committee for the overall criminal justice study. And along with Allison, who can't be on the call tonight, I am the co-chair of the sentencing committee. And the sentencing committee, as a group with all of us, did our first interview today of the executive director, Sarah Andrews, of the Ohio Criminal Sentencing Commission. And that it went well, but let's see, Kimberly was part of that today. And it went well, but we're always looking to do better. So we think tonight's session will help us refine it for our upcoming interviews that we're going to be doing with some judges over the next couple of weeks. David, you're muted.
Got it. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. You know, as soon as you started introducing your role with this study, then I thought, oh, I never mentioned, I am involved as a co-chair with Mindy Hedges on the reentry portion. So that's sort of at the very end of it. Let's see. Tim, would you mind going next?
Yeah, sure, David. Thank you. So I'm Tim Vieser. I am a board member for the League of Women Voters of the Cincinnati area. As Cheryl noted, I'm co-chairing with her the core planning. I am the chair of the policing subcommittee, and we've got a little project going on in Cincinnati on policing. And we just had a really great interview session with a number of former, I'll call them executive posts and so on, with the city of Cincinnati. So we had 3 veterans there on a sort of private forum. So still learning. So how about Elizabeth? You're next to me.
Elizabeth Grazer. I'm the operations manager for the League of Women Voters in Columbus, and I am part of the core planning committee and provide a lot of the administrative support. And I will toss it to Lynn.
Oh, thank you. And you do way more than that. You do a lot of all of the technical stuff, and we wouldn't be able to do everything we do without you. That is for sure. So with that being said, I'm Lynn Knoll. I am out of Cleveland, and I am co-chair of the incarceration subcommittee. And we have not had any interviews yet, although we do have a few people identified who we would like to interview, and we want to get a very broad spectrum. For example, we want to be able to talk to the union that represents all of the prison guards at the state prisons and speak with other prison officials, as well as advocacy groups for prisoners. There's been a lot going on in the Cleveland area, particularly with the county jail. So I thought that getting some training on interviewing would be extremely important. So Nadia.
Hey, I'm Nadia Zaim. I'm also from the Cleveland League, and I am the chair of the pretrial and trial procedure subcommittee. And like Lynn, we are also planning to interview a variety of people. So this is a good for us to get some training on this before we get started with that. So thank you, David, for doing this for us.
Janice, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, I'm Janice Ford, Lakewood chapter of the Greater Cleveland League. I'm on reentry, and I mistook this for our rescheduling of the other one, but it sounds, our missed meeting, but it sounds interesting, so I'm going to sit through it.
Great.
And we're glad that you're with us. And if at some point you decide, oh, I'm unlikely to need it or something, Janice, you shouldn't feel like you must stay. And I will get you a notification in terms of our rescheduling. So feel free to do as your schedule allows. Let's see. Linda, could you introduce yourself?
All right. I have been a member of League of Women Voters for quite a few years, except I have just become active in the last year. So I'm pretty much a newcomer in that way. I am a retired speech and language therapist, and am obviously very interested in communication. So I have been working on the Race and Policing Committee here in Cincinnati. And I thought I would try to get involved in one of these criminal justice committees, and hoping to go with one of those in the immediate future. So.
That's great. Thank you so much. My background is in communication, but I'm really looking at it from the human communication or the interpersonal small group side. But at Wayne State, where I did my graduate work, the speech therapists were on the 4th floor, and my department was on the 5th floor. So I'm very familiar with what your background includes.
Okay.
Gail, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, I am a committee member with Nadia on the pretrial committee. I am a member of the Geauga League of Women Voters, and for that responsibility, I head up our Observer Corps. We go into local county meetings, and so this is more of a bigger picture than I'm used to doing. So it's been great.
That's great. Thank you so much. Kathy, would you introduce yourself? Oh, yes, that Kathy, but you're muted right now.
Hi, I'm a new member in Lakewood, and I just moved back to the Cleveland area after being out west for 35 years. And Janice told me about the criminal justice committee, and I'm a retired physician. I was in behavioral health, and I'm finding this subject just fascinating, and what's going on in Ohio. And by the way, did anybody see, I don't know, on TV, the League of Women Voters Ohio president was just on the news.
Oh, just now.
Yeah, yes, at like about an hour ago, MSNBC, I think, but.
Let me guess, they're talking about gerrymandered districts.
Yes, and
Jen Miller
was thrilling. And as Janice told me, Ohio has been working on this since the 1970s. It was a real, so you'll be, it made Ohio League look good. Good reason.
That's wonderful.
And I came
I'm so glad
tonight,
you.
I came tonight because you teach communications, and I thought, this sounds like it's probably going to be good. Thank you.
All right. Let's see. I'm losing track of who has been introduced. Kimberly, I think you haven't yet.
Oh, thank you. Good evening. My name is Kimberly Jacobs, and I'm with the Cincinnati League, and I'm a member of the sentencing subcommittee with Cheryl, and the policing and race committee with Tim, which they've already described very well. I'm also assist with the program development committee. We're in the middle of program planning, member of voter services, excuse me, etc., and was very, very impressed with the work that was done, and it continues to be done with redistricting. Last year, I showed up at hearings and I testified in front of the commission, and I am just so thrilled that you know, we've mounted two huge hurdles, and it looks like we may be on the way to finally giving Ohio voters what they actually wanted. But anyway, I love to talk to people professionally and personally, but I've never had interview training, and it sounds intriguing, and I'm sure I'll find it useful no matter what I do. So thank you.
Well, welcome. Thank you so much. Colleen is in the chat. She says that she's monitoring her toddler children's bedtime. So she's listening tonight. She is a member of the Greater Cleveland Lakewood chapter, but she's also a member of the entry group with me. And so when I saw her name pop up on the screen, I was excited to say hi. Colleen, while she says she's not comfortable interviewing people, has actually been quite active helping my team, specifically Mindy Hedges, to document the interviews that Mindy has been doing. So I know that Colleen was involved in at least taking some of the transcription or capturing some of the transcription, which is a challenging role. So I'm happy that you're here, and certainly it's fine to continue to function in the dual role of parent and participant. Who have I missed?
Hi, my name's Lynn Miller, and I joined a little late. I am on the subcommittee, the pretrial and trial procedure subcommittee, with Nadia and Gail, who I assume already introduced themselves. And just by way of background, I am a lawyer by training. I'm semi-retired at this point, so I am comfortable interviewing witnesses, but I've never participated in an academic exercise like this. And so I thought this would be helpful information.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lynn. I am not a lawyer, and I'm not trained as a lawyer. And so I thought it might be interesting, and we even talked about this previously, to see the differences between maybe the training that you're provided and sort of strategies that you might use. So feel free to help us learn too, and I certainly will share my perspective. I don't think Leah introduced herself.
Hi, yeah. So I'm Leah. I am the current president of the League of Greater Youngstown, and I am on the incarceration committee. I'm comfortable with interviews. I interviewed women who were in prisons when I was in grad school in California, so that's not new to me, but refresher's always good. It's been a little while. And it's just, because of my educational background, I'm interested in this topic. Has nothing to do with my current job, which is with national service programs, but glad to be here to help in any way I can.
That's great. Thank you so much. My colleague, Jeff Tyus, Dr. Jeff Tyus, is actually a faculty member at Youngstown State, near, I suspect, wherever you are. So if by chance he's involved with the league, that's awesome. If he's not, maybe we should find a way to get him involved.
Yes.
I was going to move next to share my screen, but there's quite a few pictures on my screen too. I may not see your hand go up or recognize that you'd like to add something. So maybe what we can do is use the chat. Should you have a question and you want to put it in the chat? I think Tim agreed that he would kind of keep an eye on that for me, because in the function of trying to do the talking, sometimes it's hard to do multiple things at once. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and I hope I do it properly. Can you see that screen now? It says League of Women Voters Ohio. All right. Well, all right. I definitely tried to take advantage of documents, slides that I had already created for a classroom situation. So I guess I apologize in advance if they don't fit perfectly with our purpose, but I tried to think about, and maybe we'll provide some examples of how this can help us. And there we go. First of all, I thought kind of an overview of sort of the process. So thinking in terms of the prep work that goes into interviews, certainly as a first step. And so we would definitely want to take some time to think ahead about, all right, what is our objective? Who is it that we need to talk to? What do we know about that person, and what are the kinds of things that might likely be concerns that they have that might limit or restrict their ability to be open and honest with us about the issues? Can we be sure to be clear about what is our purpose, and they can be clear that they understand that purpose and be able to respond effectively, or refer us to someone that might be more effective given the purposes that we may have. So understanding those objectives, I think, and coming to some mutual agreements about those things can certainly be helpful. Obviously, that's different when you're an attorney and you've got a client, and those interviews conducted in a much different kind of a way. I do think that it's important we structure the interview carefully, we set up a proper sort of scope and time, and we need to restrict or limit ourselves in terms of what's a reasonable amount of time to talk to the people that we have in mind. Already we've heard about people suggesting they wanted to talk to judges, to representatives of the unions, I should say of the guards that are unionized in some of our prisons, maybe some other prison officials, be that state prisons or maybe county jails. Maybe advocacy individuals. So are there other people that we think about that we envision perhaps wishing we could interview? And you can go ahead.
For me, I would say we're going to be interviewing prosecutors and defense attorneys as well as the judges.
Right.
We'll have.
So those are both elected officials and not elected officials. So.
Good point. Chip?
Police chiefs,
right.
sheriffs, police union representatives, and probably some law enforcement associations, as well as probably some groups like ACLU and so on.
Oh, right. Good.
We should probably also get some people who have gone through it on the other end.
So you're suggesting an individual who is formerly incarcerated?
Yeah, that could be tricky. I understand that, but it's always frustrating when the only input is from the management. I mean, the follow-ups I've seen in the office, where they simply didn't ask the people who do the work.
Right. No, that's a good point. And it leads me to think about what's the proper language to talk about those individuals. So formerly incarcerated is the word I chose. And then I thought, oh, that's not necessarily the term that a person may wish to be used by. So returning citizen might be another term. Perhaps
that's what the Ohio reentry uses.
Well, then there's also people who maybe didn't get incarcerated, who went through the system, but were not necessarily incarcerated.
So you're suggesting a person who was never convicted of a crime, or because of
who was charged with a crime, but never actually ended up imprisoned.
Right.
Maybe ended up on probation or
right.
Or
That's
didn't get convicted.
Yeah, thank you.
So maybe we say something like impacted individuals.
Oh, that's good. I'm making some notes too, and I encourage others to do the same. So as I approach my classroom, I talk about the structure of the interview having an opening, sort of a body, and a conclusion or a closing. And I think that's pretty common to all of us as we think about whether it's a speech, whether it's a letter that we might write, whether it's an interview that we might conduct. So this is pretty normal. But the opening has a couple specific purposes, and I really think it helps to think about what does one expect in the opening of an interview, and what are the kinds of things that the others may desire or hope that are going to be accomplished, as well as things that you want to make sure you get accomplished. So I often talk about a two-step process. One, we're establishing rapport, building a relationship. And of course, don't I think about everything as a relationship, right? That's my training. But building that relationship and then orienting everyone involved, and it could be that you've got a note taker as well as an interviewer as well as an interviewee. So orienting all parties in terms of what are the objectives, the time frame, and the outcomes that you're hoping to accomplish. Obviously, the opening will be dictated by the situation and the nature of the relationship. So if you already knew the person in advance, well, that makes that a little bit simpler. But if this is a person you've never met before, they don't have any idea of who you are or what you represent, then you're going to have to spend a little bit more time in the opening. But it will pay off dividends to be able to help you to get to the conversation that you really want to get to.
Just before we go on, I wanted to add, David, that Leah said that there's a nonprofit reentry program in Youngstown called United Returning Citizens. I'm going to pass that on to the reentry committee.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's beautiful. I did not know about that group. And I think what we're finding in our reentry group is that there are just all kinds of different sorts of organizations, various nonprofits that assist with the reentry, but there's no sort of organized place that all those individuals or all those groups kind of convene. So probably not unlike other parts of the challenge that we have, that it's sort of decentralized so severely that nobody knows what the other group is doing.
Yeah, to that point, I mean, I'm sure you guys on reentry are aware of Edwin's in the Cleveland area. That's
okay, so that's
Edwin's. Well, the New York Times actually had like a little blurb about them again in their New York Times magazine. I'll send it to you later. But it started with a chef who was doing all kinds of training for culinary skills.
right.
So they opened a restaurant called Edwin's, and that's in the Shaker Buckeye neighborhood of Cleveland. It's a French restaurant. So everyone who works there, is a returning citizen or an impacted individual, and they receive all of this training, and they work there, and they actually provide housing. And it's just an amazing program. It has gotten a lot of national attention, but they also, and this kind of goes to incarceration committee, have online courses for people to learn culinary skills, no matter where they're at. So I'll send you some more information on that.
Thanks, Lynn. I do appreciate that. I'm going to move to my next slide as we begin to think about, let's see if I did that right. Yeah. The business of establishing that relationship, that rapport. Obviously, you want to have some small talk, but you got to be careful about how much and where does that go and how does it help you to achieve your outcomes. But to have some background about who am I talking to, if this is a judge or if this is a prosecutor, what is their time frame and what's reasonable to expect, and how can you manage your time effectively with them? I think you need to be careful to avoid making assumptions too about, all right, so they're the union representative for the guards, but what does that entail? And assumptions about, what do we think that involves, and what are their perspectives going to be? We have to be thoughtful and careful about that. Whoops. So providing some orientation in terms of our purpose, maybe the length of the interview, the nature of the interview, those kinds of things. Now, one of the things that I did is, in talking to my wife, her company does quite a bit of these interviews on an education side, trying to talk to people to understand and then impact policy as it relates to state education policy. So, for instance, her work in California has been involving talking to school superintendents as well as teachers and parents and other groups about equity, because California is really looking carefully at equity during the pandemic, trying to make sure when they come out of this pandemic that they're not going to have lost all kinds of people of color in particular. So her interviews led her to create a template for the interview itself. I'm hoping that I can place, I'm struggling, in the chat. Yes, I think I've put a link to the document that I added to our Google Drive that relates to the interview tool that Susan suggested, and I modified slightly to help us in terms of developing kind of a template that might be useful. It's not required from my perspective, but might be useful to us in terms of gathering the information and conducting our interviews. Let's see. From there, I wanted to make sure that we talked a bit about the difference between anonymity and confidentiality. The idea that I can keep a person's identity anonymous, but share their ideas. Or perhaps somebody says, I cannot in any way, shape, or form be identified, and this is just entirely confidential. This is off the record. I can't have people quoting me, even if I'm not identified. So we got to make sure that we're understanding who we're talking to and whether they're comfortable, allowing their ideas to be shared anonymously, or whether perhaps they're okay identifying that, hey, I'm Sheriff whatever, and this is, my perspective. So those kinds of conversations I think are important to have up front.
David, is there a legal distinction between them? Because what I hear is that the anonymity is that you're withholding or disguising an identity, but sharing the quote, and confidentiality is basically it. In essence, nothing that they say can be shared other than you've got background in your head. Is that sort of the difference? Is there a legal
That's the way, that's the way I would think of it, but I'm not the lawyer in this group. And so I don't know whether there are legal distinctions that can be established or past practice that's can clarify there.
We also had a question about how and when do you talk about taping the interview?
This is a great question. And generally speaking, I think you want to do that pretty early. My sense is, and I suggested this already, maybe it's good to have somebody that's a note taker and then someone else that's the interviewer, if possible. If that's not possible, then hitting the record button certainly would be a nice option, but I think you want to ask permission before you go ahead and do that. And it may be that people are less comfortable sharing if they know it's being recorded. On the other hand, maybe they're happy with it as long as they understand the purpose for the information, why it's being gathered, and how it'll be used. Keeping in mind
that before the interview or during the interview?
Yes. I mean, I think you could do it before. And if you don't address it before, then obviously you do that at the beginning of the interview, where you could say, this is our purpose and this is who I am, and our goal is to do these things. Would it be acceptable to you if we go ahead and record this Zoom interview? Or if you're in person, I've brought a tape recorder, would it be acceptable for me to record it on my phone or on my recorder device? Does that help?
David, on the interview that we did today, we actually put in our email request that we hope to be able to record it if it was okay with our interviewee. And she responded right away that yes, she ended up volunteering to provide not only the Zoom link, but to record it and send us the recording. And I think you'll find that some people are so willing to help with your cause that they will do that kind of thing for you. And while I'm on that note, I think I want to mention the value of finding a friendly interview to do first.
Oh, yeah. That's a really good point, Cheryl. So one that you're comfortable with and that you're not encountering or anticipating any difficulties, things like that, certainly makes the whole process a bit easier. Good suggestion. And I like the idea of sharing in your email when you're setting up the interview, your intention that, if possible, I'd like to be able to record it. That's a good idea. Any other thoughts there while I... Okay.
I guess I have a thought. When we're thinking about like all these different subcommittees, talking to different agencies and persons and et cetera, there might be some overlap. So just a thought that came to me is like, for example, the United Returning Citizens in Youngstown, right? These are people who have re-entered into society, but it might be also helpful for the incarceration committee to also interview the same individuals to reflect on their experiences while incarcerated. So maybe rather than doing 2 interviews, we do 1 that kind of combines that. So there might be overlap in areas, just a thought where we might collaborate as committees on these.
Yeah, I like that idea. I think that we probably are not going to have difficulty finding people that are returning citizens. I suspect that we will have plenty of that. But if you've got a person that seems to be really insightful, who is willing to share and would be open to it, I think some collaboration would be a great idea.
I'm thinking about administrators who might be approached by different subcommittees also, and they, I think, might really appreciate not having to have 2 interviews, even though the questions, one subcommittee might have somewhat different questions, but
Well, what we might do is to coordinate on that is when the core planning committee is to just make mention of who's up. And that way, if at the very least, other representatives from the other committee might be able to sit in on that. That's probably our best way to try to.
Yeah.
So the other way that we may be able to manage this too is if we incorporate at the end of our interview a question that says, there may be other people interested in talking to you. Would you have interest in being interviewed by one of these other interview teams, right? Be it the policing or the reentry or whichever. So there are a couple ways that we might be able to manage that. The slide I have next is sort of an activity that I would use with students, and we can choose to use it or just talk through it. But how might you start interviewing? In other words, how would you introduce yourself? My name is David Bodery. I'm a member of the Dayton League of Women Voters. And, right, what is my purpose? Those kinds of things. How might we explain our objective? How would you describe your connection to the project? What role would the nonpartisan league's involvement take? In other words, how are you going to describe the league so that if a person unfamiliar with the league is being introduced to it, now how do you use that to leverage why they would want to participate? Thoughts about that?
It's probably the thing that I get out of it is that we also want to have a relationship. If we can have a study, but there may be a day when we're going to be advocating, and certainly continuing that relationship in the future. It would be helpful to make sure that they understood who we were. We're not the enemy.
In the template, and I tried to provide a link in the chat, I don't know if that worked or not, I added some language in this introduction portion in the template. The language I chose was, volunteers of the League of Women Voters, Ohio, are conducting interviews across the community to better understand the complexities of our state's criminal justice processes. Interviewers seek to inform and enable the League of Women Voters Ohio members of best practices and to adopt positions on criminal justice reform in the areas of policing, pretrial and trial, sentencing, incarceration, and reentry. So that's kind of a broad statement that I thought we could share, or at least modify from as a way of kind of introducing the project. And I certainly am open to the feedback on whether that fits or works or not. I go on to say, your input is valuable and will inform additional developments of the League of Women Voters Ohio study. If at any point you would like to share something that you would like to keep off the record, please let me know. Any questions before we begin? So sort of leaving them room to say, oh gosh, off the record, this is what I want to tell you. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Again, I offer that as a suggestion, but others I think are going to make that their own or come up with something far better than whatever I had tried to put together. I do think helping people understand the league and the nonpartisan role that the league is working to take is important. I think the news that we're getting, and it sounds like even tonight on CNBC, I mean, that suggests to people that we are working hard on behalf of democracy, as opposed to sort of taking a partisan stand, really trying to help make sure that this experiment of democracy can work. As we get through the introduction, then we move into the body of the interview. And so that's where we begin to utilize the questions. And this is where in a classroom, I would spend quite a bit of time, probably a couple class periods, working out ideas of question types, as well as secondary questions. So primary and secondary, those kinds of things. The most important thing that I think my students struggle with is the idea that they need to be listening while they're in this process. In other words, oftentimes they're great at asking a question and then they forget to listen to the response. And then all they know to do is go on to the next question. And they really miss a pretty great opportunity to dig in, to explore, to probe deeper, or to ask for clarification. And so if there's anything I want my students to understand, and I would encourage all of us to understand, is that we can't just ask a question and wait. We've got to be listening carefully and checking, making sure that we understand and digging in a little bit. So certainly there are open and closed questions. I'll talk briefly about what that means. I suspect many of you are already familiar and thinking ahead about what that means. There are primary and secondary, as well as neutral, leading, and loaded questions. My sense is that an attorney might have a plan to ask a question in such a way that they know the answer to that question and that it's probably closed in the sense that there's one or two words that the person being asked the question will respond in. I suspect also that there are times when those questions can feel a little bit leading, if not perhaps even loaded, and we'll talk briefly about that. But the most important thing is the listening business. Did I skip something? No. All right. So the guide, and that's really what I've sent to the chat, is this link to a template. It's something that you can plan in advance, structure yourself so you've got a sense of what are the areas you want to cover, what questions might you use to get there. It doesn't mean you'll actually use all those questions because perhaps the conversation takes a different turn. That's okay, as long as you planned it out, you've got a sense of where you want to go with things. And that will ensure that you get back to those things if they're really important too. It can also help to record your responses. And so the template that my wife suggested has a spot for recording responses as well. Questions about that? Go ahead.
Thank you. I think that is a wonderful, I'm so glad you did that. This is out of order, I'm sure, but I was just thinking, is this going to come up? The person that I'm interviewing has a strong opinion about, I don't know, like the ethics of something that goes on in prison, or and the other problem I can imagine is the interviewee having, let's see, thinking that I have some power, that I can do something. Say someone who is a returning citizen. I think the preparation for those interviews needs to be a little bit extensive.
Sure. I'm thinking about a couple responses. One, if a person has a very strong opinion, I think our response to that individual to say, what I hear you saying is that you feel very strongly about this and that you think that this is absolutely wrong or absolutely better or absolutely worse or whatever, so that you're sort of demonstrating that you've heard. And obviously then you're kind of taking notes of that. Later on, then we have to find the juxtaposition of that, because of course, just because one person has a strong opinion of something doesn't make it so. It might be that there are reasons for the way things work, and we have to come to understand those things. And that's where we have to take a sort of a step back, a more neutral position, and be able to take that unbiased perspective. Not to suggest that there aren't going to be things that frustrate us too, but we probably have to do our best to hold off in terms of taking our own position into the room with us. We probably have to be a little bit more neutral. There are different ways that we might sequence the questions we ask. For instance, they could be organized topically, just like I've got 4 things I want to talk about and just the topics. But you might also approach it from a problem solution perspective or cause and effect perspective. So thinking about your particular area or issue, perhaps that leads you to think about whether there are just these topics and we're going to hit them, or whether maybe there's a sequence of things. Problem, cause, solution is another way that you might begin to organize things. So what is the problem? What are the causes that you understand associated with that problem? And are there solutions that your organization or you individually might know about that could help us? So those kinds of approaches might be useful. I'll pause.
I had another question.
Sure.
Especially, we're a group doing the interview. So I'm thinking that for someone who's feeling a little unsure, uneasy about the interview, maybe there's just one of us doing the interview and the rest of us are just more or less on the Zoom call, maybe not even showing our faces. I don't know. What do people think who've already done some interviews?
I suggested a note taker can be really helpful. And I will say this, when I do training, like in a corporate training, I like working with another person because it gives my brain a chance when they're asking a question or interacting to think about, all right, what have I missed? And so how can I go back there? So it might be useful to have more than one person or to have an interviewer and then a note taker. But then if the note taker says, oh, wait, can you clarify this? That kind of gives you a sense of making sure you covered all the bases. Tim, you had thoughts about that when we did our first discussion. Maybe I made that up.
I'm just going to pitch in that the idea of having two there is useful because it's hard to stay on track, process what you're hearing, and record it. So having at least one other person there, and if it's sometimes helpful if you're concerned about breaking up the flow to ask the partner, is there anything I've missed? Do we need any clarification? Is there anything that you are thinking, so that you can encourage that rather than it sort of getting away from the script, if you will?
David,
Good, thank you. Sure.
David, in our group, we generated the questions that we wanted to ask as a group at various times and put them all together. I actually ordered them in a sequence that I thought was logical, and then gave everybody the opportunity to select which of the questions they wanted to ask, which put them in the position to do any follow-up questions on it that they wanted to ask as well.
Nice.
Two other things to add quickly is we actually had an agenda that I sent ahead of time to our interviewee, and we sent our short bios ahead of time too, to make that part go a little quicker.
That's a great idea. So not only do you know a bit about them, but they now know a bit about you. That's very nice. Good. Gail, that's a good question. I appreciate you asking it. So open, closed, obviously open questions allow many responses. Closed questions have short, typically single word answers. Take a look at what that might look like. So open questions might be things like what, why, or how, whereas closed questions tend to be who, when, or where. Now, there's lots of other possible questions when we begin to kind of put these pieces together, but that gives you at least a little bit of sense of that. Oftentimes, it makes me a little crazy, but media interviews ask closed questions when what they really want is the how or the what or the the why, but they ask crazy closed questions. Did you feel excited? Well, of course I felt excited, right? Now what you really want to know is, what did that excitement feel like, right? So you got to ask the question that you really want the answer to. Does that make sense to folks? Yeah.
Yeah. One trouble with a closed question is they have a tendency to be unanswerable.
When they're complex, you're right, because there is not a yes or a no. It's a, well, it depends. That's the joke I use in class because I teach undergraduates, and the graduate school answer to everything is always the same. It depends. And of course, the graduate school answer then is able to respond and say what it depends on, right? And so that really becomes sort of that, hey, graduate school is easy. The answer is always the same. It depends. My sophomores don't appreciate me either. Secondary questions obviously can be really helpful. And this is where we can begin to get into what I think of as oftentimes the meat and to seek the clarification. So we can just use head nods, right? The silent and, right? Just little nudges, or information probes, things that will ask people to sort of give us a little more detail in those areas, things like that. I will make these slides available, and I do have a few more bits of information in the notes, but information probes explain things like, well, what do you mean by, or you used an acronym there, but I'm not sure I'm familiar with it. Could you explain that? Those kinds of details. Was there a question? No? Restatement then simply restates the question again, and we hear this oftentimes in the media, although maybe it doesn't make the news. But if you're at a news conference, people will ask the same question multiple times because the politicians don't answer the question the first time. It sometimes takes 3 attempts to get a person to actually answer the question. So if you feel like you have to, dig a little deeper and just ask the same question, but what I asked was this, right? That kind of a thing. Reflection probes for me are really cool because they reflect the answer in order to help you clarify. So for instance, my example might be, well, when you said high cholesterol, do you mean high bad cholesterol or triglycerides? Which are you talking about, right? So asking a point of clarification. Kathy, I hope I used those terms correctly. Kathy is our medical doctor. And then mirror probes or summary, sometimes known as summary probes. This might be better understood as summarizing what a person has said and then asking, have I got that right? So what I hear you saying is, et cetera, have I got that? And then they can say, well, you got most of it, but here's where you missed it, right? So that there's a chance for them to clarify. And my favorite, of course, and I've actually built it into the template, is a clearinghouse probe. And it's often the most useful question. Is there anything else that you think might be helpful to our investigation or to our understanding, or however you want to frame that? And oftentimes it's those very sort of broad, open-ended options at the end where they say, well, you never asked me about this, and this is really important. So then they kind of drop that golden nugget right in your lap.
Yeah, on that point, I can't emphasize how important that is. As an attorney, I remember interviewing someone in an investigation, and I could just tell this woman wanted to tell me something, but I just wasn't hitting it. I just wasn't asking. I just wasn't asking the right question, and I was really struggling. And so I finally did the clearinghouse question, and she's like, well, as a matter of fact, yes. And it was like such valuable information. So I really can't emphasize that enough.
Yeah. And Scott Simon, who interviews on NPR often, would talk about the last question, and then he asks a question after the last question. And his explanation is that after you ask what you claim is your last question, somehow people's guard kind of drops a little bit. And so then you ask the follow-up after that, and all of a sudden you're getting this fresh new information that you didn't anticipate. So I share that simply because I have a great deal of respect for Scott and the work that he does with NPR, and I always found that to be quite interesting.
Hey, David, we had
Sure.
a question. It said, Gail wanted to know, would you ever recommend giving the interviewee the questions ahead of time?
I think that could help. And it sounds like, Cheryl, did you do that? Did you share the question or question areas? No? Okay. It might be helpful to share question areas. I know in some of the work that we do on campus, I do give my students some of the questions that I'll be asking about in advance. It might be more questions than I actually have time to ask, so I'm kind of making them do some homework ahead of time. But it might be useful if you were to say, hey, we're going to ask questions in these areas, and that way they'll be able to sort of be thoughtful about it, and perhaps even provide you some documentation or other sorts of supporting materials, should that be within their sort of purview to be able to provide. Yeah, Cheryl.
David, the downside of that is in a previous life, I remember doing that once and I got very canned answers.
Mhm.
So I don't do that anymore, because when you ask them in person, you get more thoughtful rather than canned. They're not working just hard to tell you what they want you to know. They're a little bit more spontaneous. Now, there's
Right.
probably the opposite case as well, but just be careful, because it could make it so you're not getting as much interaction and as much detail as you might get if it was more interactive.
And it may also depend on who you're interviewing, right? Because a judge might be very cautious if they don't know what's happening ahead of time, right? Because perhaps they like to control things in a way that sort of manages things better for them. I'm putting this on them. I'm imagining that to be the case. I don't know. Or maybe the county sheriff has, certain restrictions of what he is going to say publicly or not. And so giving him a little bit of a heads up, or her, could be beneficial. But again, I think we have to make those choices and decide as best we can. And the answer is always, it depends, right? So it depends on who we're interviewing, what's their likelihood of being able to respond in the moment, or maybe be hesitant to respond without a little pre-planning. Any other suggestions or insights with respect to that good question?
Well, this is slightly, and if this was mentioned earlier, I apologize, but just like a thought for everyone to just make sure you're careful on how you phrase your questioning and don't have assumptions in it. For example, there may be interviewing some folks. This is more work related, but example it came to my head. How do you struggle with accessing food, but that might not be something they perceive as a struggle? So you're like, what do you struggle with living in a low income household? Like making sure we're not putting an answer in the question. I don't know if that's probably the best example, but just something to be very careful and cautious of.
Absolutely. And so that's sort of the direction of a leading question, isn't it? Sort of projecting on them the answer that you want them to provide. And we see lots of examples of that in the media, but we probably have had an encounter too when people have been asking us questions. So we look through the different types of secondary questions. I think these can be very useful. The next activity was one that I've used in class, where I ask people to respond to a question. Now, I created this sort of based on our situation, the criminal justice process, and you could pick one, right? Policing, or pretrial, or sentencing, or incarceration, reentry, whatever, is complicated. There are several different aspects to consider. So that's what the person says to us. Now, what do we say in response, right? So how do we respond? What do we probe into with respect to that? What are our possibilities?
Like what? What are those?
Yeah,
things?
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, what are some of those complexities, right? Or complicated aspects?
Yeah.
So the interviewee says this.
The interviewer might respond by saying, hey, this process is complicated, right? Reentry is complicated. There are lots of different things that you have to consider. And so now the interviewer has to decide, well, how do I respond to that, right? What do I say next?
Well, which are most important to you? I'd like to look at them first.
Sure, good. And then you could even work your way back, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so then they say something, right? And then we have to think about how do we respond to that. And here's where my students just go on to their next primary question, as opposed to really digging into an answer. And unfortunately, I don't have a good way to help demonstrate that. But if you think about it, listening carefully and then digging in, demonstrating that you heard them, right? So what I hear you saying is, these are the things that are complicated about it. Have I got them all? Did I miss any, right? So helping to kind of gather that data up can be really useful. But you can also see where this could take some time, right? And imagine if you've got 6 questions you want to get into, but the first one takes 20 minutes, now what, right? So you have to kind of, I think, plan ahead and think about, how do I do this effectively and respectful of the person's time too. There are some pitfalls, and these are common that my students have a tendency to fall into. And so I'll try to help you understand these. And again, I will share the slides, and I have some notes that are on each of the slides too. A bipolar trap is when you ask a closed question when you really want an open response. So the example I shared earlier, are you excited? When really what you want to know is, what are you most excited about, right? Because are you excited is a closed question with a one-word answer, yes or no. And that's not going to get you what you want. An open to closed switch is asking an open question and then quickly following it up with a closed question. So what do you think about the sentencing project? Is it a good idea? And what you really want is the open-ended, what do you think about the sentencing project? Why do you think that? How could it be better? Or what would make it worse? Because sometimes, right, to understand how to make something better, you can think first about what would make it worse. Well, if we took this away, it'd be worse. So that means this is really important, right? So how do we sort of ask those questions in a way that can get us what we want to know and not fall into a trap? Was there another comment? Obviously, double barrel questions are things where you're asking more than one question at a time. Tell me about your background with reentry and what do you think can be done to improve the process? Well, you got to break those up, right? So ask one and then ask the other. A leading push, interjecting our feelings or suggesting a preferred response, which I think, was it Laura? Somebody helped with that one. So you support the sentencing database project like most Ohioans, right? This is where I get frustrated when political pollsters call my house, right? And they start asking their questions for whichever candidate. My wife is one party and I'm the other. And they have these questions that are so loaded and you're just like, are you serious? No wonder you get the results that you get, right? A guessing game is just that, when you're guessing at a person's answer. Did you do that because you were against reform, right? So did you do that because this? Like, just ask, why did you do that? And give them the full option of their response, as opposed to restricting it and suggesting that you know somehow more than they do. A yes, no response, questions that have an obvious answer. Do you always support collateral sanctions? Instead of asking, in what instance do you support collateral sanctions and why? Collateral sanctions is an issue that came up in the reentry group because evidently there are these sort of unintended consequences of some of the sanctions that occur as a person is exiting prison. They're known as collateral sanctions. Don't ask me anymore. Curious questions just probably have no place for things. We ought not to be asking things out of curiosity. Instead, we ought to have a reason for it, right? So we really need to know this because, as opposed to, well, I'm curious, what do you think about this? No, let's be honest. Why? Questions about the pitfalls. I think what becomes clear is that it's not easy to ask good questions. It takes some practice, it takes some time. And Cheryl, I think it was Cheryl, suggested it might be good to start with an easy one, right? A friendly one, as I think her term was. So a really strong idea. So then the last steps are to close the interview out. You take your time. You want to be tactful in what you say and what you do in the closing. It often can signal also a continuation of the relationship. So you don't want the relationship to end. Even with my students, and it's an employment relationship, and let's imagine that the student isn't chosen for the job, but they can end it right. That could leave the door open for them to be considered for a different job at that same company, right? So you don't close the door simply because it didn't come out the way you wanted. You try to find a way to leave the door open. And so I suggest in the template on the third page, if later I had questions, could I email you? Oh, what email would you want me to use, right? So the idea that you can then capture and make sure that you've got the right way to contact, although it sounds like many of you are already planning to email to start. But to ask that question to ensure that, if we had something that came up later, could I still give you a call? And they say yes, and that way later on, should you need, you have that ability, you'll feel comfortable doing it, and they will have sort of committed to agreeing to accepting the phone call or taking that email. Question about that? Mayor, yes, go ahead, Kathy. Oh, muted. There you go.
From my experience, that people in need things and look for people in places to get them from. And so if there are some interviews, and I'm thinking of returning citizens that with whom that's what I want to make clear, that I'm not offering by doing the interview. It's not, I'm different from the other volunteers who are maybe at that reentry assistance place that are asking, what do you need? And I'll help you. So that I would agree with what you're saying, but except for when you do wanna.
So what I hear you saying then, Kathy, is that you want to have a way to contact them, but you don't necessarily want to give them your cell phone number.
No, I'm not sure I want, I guess anybody else, there's this just me.
No, you're not wrong.
Leading
And I
people
think
on
that's
is what I'm, yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right that this is how I can help you. I'm going to help you by taking your voice to the state league and sharing this as we develop a consensus, right? That's how I can help you. But I'm not in a position to loan you $10 for the gas tank or to refer you or write a letter of recommendation in regard to whatever, because I just simply don't know you that well. So it's okay to say that.
Well, can you also just say, I'm doing a research project? That tells them you're not a social worker. You're not a churchgoer who's visiting and offering stuff,
Right.
You're accumulating information.
And that probably goes into the beginning, right? When we talk about who is the league and what is my role with the league and how is it that I'm going to use this information and what can I do? So yeah, that's a good point. And then maybe you reiterate it at the end. Go ahead, Kathy.
Yeah, research is a loaded concept. And there are people who are subjects in research have all these rights that they need to know even way more than what we're telling them. So I would be careful if you're not doing research. Informal research might be. I
think you're overthinking this. Actually.
But what Kathy is aware of is the IRB, it's the Institutional Review Board, that are required of true researchers. And that would include not only people that we ask to fill out a survey or accept a placebo drug, but also these interviews could be seen that way. So yeah, I think if you want to say it's a information gathering process, there's not a research question, right? I mean, we're gathering information to better understand X. Maybe that's the way to talk about it. To avoid the term research, which could be confusing or misleading, is a good point. And Kathy, I appreciate you bringing that up. I think I have just a slide or two left. And so obviously the closing signals the termination of the interview, but not the relationship. Obviously you want to create supportiveness to enhance the relationship, bring things to a close that people are comfortable with. I think it helps to summarize and say, here are some of the main things that I heard you talk about. Here are the things that you really emphasized as I heard it. If you're able to do that effectively, you're amazing. My students typically cannot, but I think it demonstrates that you listen carefully to the extent that you can go back over notes or have the note taker share some of the key points. That would be useful. And it's a great way to confirm that you understood it as well. And then you can lead to, all right, but if later I realize I misunderstood or I missed something, is it okay if I contact you again? And then you ask for that phone number, that email or something like that. That can be really useful. So In summary, all three parts are important: the opening, the body, the closing. The opening sets us up to make sure that they understand what we're doing, who we are, and why we're doing it. But then the body obviously leads us through the process of gathering that information, hopefully listening effectively to kind of make sure we're asking those probing questions to achieve the outcomes that we're hoping to achieve. You can do much of that work in advance, but no matter how much work you do in advance, you're never going to predict exactly the responses or have the exact right thing to be set up for you. And if you just ask question after question as you planned it, you may miss some valuable information in between. The closing obviously helps to bring it to an end, but it also leaves open the opportunity for a continued relationship. And that, I think, is basically what I've got. Other thoughts, suggestions, tips?
Well done.
It's 8:07, so I don't know.
David, that was excellent. I think that's going to be very helpful to people.
Okay.
Oh, I agree. This is very worthwhile.
Well, good. I do think that the graduate school answer is always it depends. So we have to think about who are we asking to interview? What are the sorts of roles and capacities of which they're experts? And how can we then make sure that we use their time effectively in order to gather the information that can be useful to our project? It's exciting. I think my team is in the phase of this where we've gathered some research. We're excited about what we're beginning to kind of understand and hopeful that we're going to be able to draw it all together. And that will be sort of the next phase. Cheryl.
Just one additional thought. As we started talking about the judges that we wanted to interview, we wanted to make sure that we were getting judges both from urban counties and rural counties, that we were getting both sides of the political divide, that we are demographically representative in the subjects we choose to interview. So don't forget those criteria too, as you compile your list of people you want to interview.
I'm glad you brought that up because it was part of my thought as we were considering interviewing one person from maybe 2 or 3 of the various project perspectives. The disadvantage of interviewing a person from reentry as well as policing might be that, hey, maybe there's 3 other people in the state that could have done that interview too. We just should have kind of diversified ourselves a little bit. So if we end up interviewing 6 people can't represent the whole state. If on the other hand, we can interview 16 people, maybe that does a better job of gathering it. So if my analogy makes sense to you.
No, I agree. I think that goes for everything though, not just judges. I mean, like we're going to be doing prosecutors. I mean, a prosecutor in an urban county is going to have a very different perspective than a prosecutor in a more rural county that doesn't have as many resources, or maybe even criminal justice issues to begin with. So I think that's important in all areas to make sure we're focusing on different areas of the state. And the benefit of us doing this as a state league is that we have members from all over the state from different areas. So it's easier for us to make those connections.
And I think about a returning citizen who is a man versus a returning citizen who's a woman, who's a returning citizen who is a woman of color, right? So very different kinds of perspectives that could be gathered there too. Linda, did you have something you wanted to add? Okay. You're fine. Any other closing thoughts? Oh, well.
I'm glad you're making this available as a recording. I think there are a lot of other people who will be interested in watching it.
Perfect. Well,
Yeah.
good.
Oh, I was
Thank you
wondering,
all.
would it be a good idea for us to have maybe like a master list somewhere of like who we're interviewing, just in case like different subcommittees
Great idea.
might be trying to contact the same person?
Yeah.
So that they don't get
even if
contacted twice
it slips our mind during a meeting, we can still add it onto the list. I agree, Nadia.
That's perfect. Tim, will you bring that up then when we gather for the leadership team meeting? We'll make sure that
Yep.
we get something started.
Yep, I
And
got a
I don't know
couple
if
of,
Elizabeth is still with us, but I mean, if Elizabeth has ideas of how we could do that efficiently, that'd be great. Yeah. I have a football game that I'm going to go back to watching. So
Okay, well, okay, for those of us who really don't care too much about football, on 60 Minutes, there is a special about Who Betrayed Anne Frank. So if anybody's interested in that.
very good.
I haven't had dinner yet.
You
Well,
can
go eat.
dinner and watch.
Well, that's
TV at
very
the same
important
time.
too.
That's
You can
right.
multitask.
thank you again, David. It was-
Thank
it was
you.
very helpful.
Absolutely.
Very
Very
worthwhile. Thank
helpful.
you.
And
All
thank
right.
you for the
Thank you.
for the
Thank you.
template too for the interviews. That will be very helpful for us as well.
Okay, and I'll add these PowerPoint slides into that same Google Drive. And Elizabeth sort of is our master controller there, but I'll make sure that it gets there.
Thanks
Thank
again.
All right. Be well.
Good night,
Thank you all.
everyone.
Good night.